Thank you, and thanks to the Consortium and the Lunder Foundation for this delightful opportunity. Much has been written on conflicts within aestheticism between rejecting popular commodity culture while yet trying to intervene to shape and direct consumers' tastes. In my paper, I argue that this contention is played out in paintings by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who attempted to redefine commodities' competing economic and aesthetic values. Unlike some aesthetes who competed with popular goods by creating more beautiful objects, including Whistler, Leighton, and the late works of Holman Hunt, Rossetti parodied the Victorian world of goods in shops, ads, and museums by depicting intentionally strange, secondhand, unfashionable objects which were the antithesis of Victorian fashion and aestheticist good taste. He blurred distinctions between high and popular cultures, rejected treating goods as signs of wealth and status, and asserted the artist's power to sanctify even kitsch objects. His parodies inflected aestheticism, bringing it into critical relations with popular culture. Aestheticism shared an ensemble mentality with popular culture. In other words, things joined by manufacturers and retailers into an economy of order that promoted itself as signifying wealth and status and taste. It was an organizing principle of material culture, embodied, I think, in Monkhouse's quote that Melody gave us. In clothing its outfits, in furniture its suites, in jewelry its parures. The ensemble structured how things were to be worn or used, but it was also a form of aesthetic organization, whether bourgeois or aesthete, or commercial aestheticism, or aesthete paintings of ensembles. But Rossetti decorated his Chelsea home, Tudor house, with disparate furniture and bric-a-brac, mixing high culture and low commercial objects. Henry Treffy Dunn likened the drawing room to a shop with its miscellaneous odds and ends out of an old furnishing shop somewhere in the slums of Lambeth, Hammersmith, or Leicester Square, filled with a medley including Chinese monstrosities in bronze. Hall Caine described outlandish and unheard of books and disorder, and oriental oddities, grinning gargoyles, and Buddhas of placid ugliness. An auction catalog listed Rossetti's things as Indian, Japanese, Albanian, Venetian, Chinese, and Irish. He owned 25 cabinets, some containing mini cabinets, and 31 glasses and mirrors. His mirrors echoed shops, his glass cases resonated with cabinets of curiosity, museums, and junk stores. Rossetti's things, called by these people I just quoted weird, outlandish, unheard of, and disorderly, were sanctified by his taste, not by fashion or retailing. In Tudor House, cheap goods were resacralized as aesthetic. Jewelry exemplifies both Victorian protocol and Rossetti's defiance and resacralizing. As Marcia Poynton notes, jewelry, touching on perception, status, culture, and economics, has a vital cultural role, marking the wearer's taste, status, and wealth. Victorian rules abounded for jewelry, in which love, mourning, family, and status were embodied in stones and shapes like hearts, birds, arrows, and flowers. Daytime jewelry was to be diminutive with few stones. Jewels for high court and evening could display diamonds and colored gemstones in elaborate designs. Oversized jewelry appeared peasant-like or ostentatious. Stones had rules, no diamonds for unmarried women, and appropriate items, coral for cameos, tortoiseshell for combs, jet for mourning. Bits of hair and jewelry signified love or mourning. Trade with Japan in the 50s provoked Japanisme. Trade with China and India influenced designs in the 60s and 70s. Archaeological discoveries provoked revivals of fashionable jewelry imitations of Egyptian, classical, Etruscan, and Renaissance objects. Rossetti preferred European and Asian folk jewelry, like the 17th century German or Tyrolean silver belt and Astarte Syriaca. He adored cheap costume jewelry from curiosity shops and what he called theatrical pieces. In a March 1873 letter to Dunn, Rossetti requested for the beloved a big showy jewel of the diamond kind, a theatrical jewel for a few shillings in Bond Street and preferably heart-shaped. The brooch is in a pendant on a chain around Fanny Cornforth's neck in the Blue Bower. It resembles Central European peasant jewelry and is a commercial piece. While it was part of a set or parure, Rossetti never depicted these items together, which would have alluded to fashion. Instead, Rossetti depicts a jumble of things. The bride's mid-19th century South Indian or Burmese bracelet depicts water monsters. About the black boy, Rossetti wrote to his patron George Ray, "I mean the color of my picture to be like jewels, and the jet would be invaluable." Clearly, this boy does not refer to Jet's protocol as mourning jewelry. The black boy, furthermore, wears a Norwegian marriage pendant on his head, I'll return to that kind of wearing, and a North African pendant around his neck. Objects are deterritorialized. The kimono here is worn incorrectly, I think a little more like a sari than a kimono. This is the jet. And these are the Norwegian and the African items. Here in this painting, the koto is one string short and a little small, and not being properly played. Furthermore, such items, often secondhand, were not appropriate for art. Portraits of women amid Asian objects usually displayed wealth and status. Most aesthetes advocated a tasteful unity of things. Rossetti preferred medleys of strange things whose juxtaposition remained illegible without references to fashion or status, but which permitted new aesthetic meanings to emerge. This also reflected a larger authentication problem. Asian things could signal good or bad taste. They could be cheaply made spin-offs from England or well-crafted objects from Asia. Things had meanings, but were also free-floating signifiers whose meanings could be invented and whose worth could be determined by manufacturing and retailing and by art. Rossetti's objects were well known to Victorians. Peasant jewelry was popular for daytime and common in international exhibitions starting in London's 1862 exhibition's display of imitation jewelry of base metal and colored glass. European peasant jewelry was highlighted at the 1867 Paris exhibition, where the fashionable jeweler Castellani placed his recreated ancient jewelry beside Italian peasant jewelry, his to show great historical periods, peasant jewelry to show a living tradition considered timeless. South Kensington curators collected Indian jewelry in gold and silver in 1851, and then items in cheaper material in 1867, and finally peasant jewelry in 1870. From 1871 to 74, small-scale international exhibitions in South Kensington featured different objects every year. In 1872, it was jewelry. This is an example of a coral necklace. And this is other examples of the jewelry in 1872 exhibition. 25% of this exhibition was peasant jewelry from Sweden, Greece, Norway, Armenia, Albania, and other places. We don't know whether Rossetti saw this show, but it's likely. The Times praised Norwegian silver chains, and South Kensington added European and Indian pieces to its collection. A pan-India display from goldwork to pewter came from the collection of Mrs. John Rivette Carnac, who was the wife of an Indian civil servant and opium trade agent. Exchange columns in the press were where women offered objects for sale or exchange. In these exchange columns of the women's magazine, The Queen, peasant jewelry was often the subject of the ornaments section. Cheap filigree from Italy and Malta was popular in the 1870s. Peasant jewelry was praised in 1867 Art Journal Illustrated Catalog. Its simplicity and presumed authenticity made it popular also with the arts and craft movement, whose taste for ruby paste, common cornelian, and agate were anticipated by Rossetti. But here, too, in painting, aesthete tastes were high-end. Pointer's Helen of Troy wears simulated Indian peasant jewelry, but this necklace was made by Carlo Giuliano, the prominent designer of the very exclusive and fashionable jeweler Castellani. No one painted the second-hand pieces Rossetti depicted, even when they depicted peasant jewelry. What Rossetti's jewelry did not include, is telling. No cameos, no sets, no enameling, no expensive gems and gold settings, no revivalist styles, no jeweled plants and birds, carved corals, diamonds, or tiaras. Hair ornaments in his paintings were brooches, pins, not the proper hair ornaments like combs or ferronnières. He did share popular taste for heart shapes, coral strands, peasant jewelry, paste, and glass. Mona Vanna exemplifies his use of jewelry. The spiral pin, his favorite piece, is in her hair on both sides. She wears popular coral, considered a bit vulgar, and the Macara bracelet, which matches nothing else. How things were worn was also significant. One book on gems, one Victorian book, described how Oriental women, quote, wreathe gems in their tresses, clasp them round their throats, their arms, their waist, decorate their bosoms, ears, fingers, ankles, and even their very toes and nostrils with them. In Rossetti's paintings, figures wear jewelry in exactly these ways, othering and orientalizing their appearance. The pearl swirl pin, Rossetti's favorite, appears in Mona Vanna's tresses, and she clasps a coral necklace orientally around her throat. Such miswearing strategically defies the revelation of social identities that fashion is supposed to reveal. How strange his accessories are is indicated by scholars' own confusion, labeling the bride's hairpiece, in some places Peruvian, in some places Chinese. It is, in fact, Chinese. As you can see here, countries from everywhere are represented. Spatially, these pieces are global but deterritorialized, and temporally, they are secondhand but without histories or origins, very déraciné. Rossetti's objects can be startling. Mona Vanna holds a very peculiar fan. Peacock or ostrich feathers implied eroticism, fashion, and elegance in art and in advertising. But her fan is owl feathers, so weird that Victorian critic F.G. Stevens called the work The Lady with the Fan. Strange objects, strangely worn and disassembled, invent their own order. These defamiliarized, theatrical, uncanny, domestic mise-en-scène of figures in dresses from no known shop or historical period is the opposite of fashionable women by Manet, Morisot, Tissot, or Whistler. Yet Rossetti insisted that Lilith and Mona Vanna were modern women. In 1873, he tried to rename Mona Vanna with a less medieval name, Belle Couleur, because he said she was so comparatively modern-looking. Domestic handbooks encouraged women to use drapery to make dresses. Mona Vanna's draped damask, which is a large cloth, not a dress at all, is white and gold, colors associated with innocence and glory, but here disassociated from such meanings because there is no narrative in which such symbolism makes sense. Her dress, in fact, contains strange protozoic shapes resonant with natural history books, some of which Rossetti owned, like this one. Wrapping his figure in upholstery, Rossetti parodies and practices the advice women were given to dress in ways harmonious with their interior decorations. He does this through excess. Rossetti further cultivated excess in other ways. Proper dress included fringe and trimmings in furnishings and dresses, which were over-accessorized with buttons, bows, ruffles, braids, and shawls. Mona Vanna's dress is trimmed with 2 sets of bows, one along the neckline and a set of green satin bows. The fan is trimmed and her hair is trimmed with the spiral pins. Victorian interior decoration books recommended trim to hide corners or harsh lines, while also drawing attention to these. Trim both concealed and accentuated. Elaine Freedgood argues that trimming is important precisely because it was dismissed as mere decoration. By the 1870s, the construction of women's dresses was so complicated that it baffled description even by contemporary experts. Trimming, a scholar has said, confuses construction and baffles the eye. Trim becomes a kind of sartorial aggression in which a dress is nearly impossible to reduce to its component parts. Associated with the feminine and the oriental, fringe-joined, puckered taffeta and draped satin, manifold flounces and braid, feather and veiling, and crinolines, creating an ambiguous flavor of feminine narcissism, sometimes considered immoral, indulgent, and irrational. Trimming, however middle class, was good taste's opposite and entrapped women in perpetual decorating. Rossetti depicts an unpresentability and illegibility of dress, but he uses trim to both allude to and perhaps outdo middle-class respectable dress. Jessica Feldman argues that for aesthetes, to decorate or ornament is intrinsically to challenge the notion of a unified mastering form of classification, fashion, or social hierarchy. The more that objects, in this case, are unrelated to narrative, history, or to each other, the less can we formulate their meanings in this thickened visual world of multiple, decommoditized, ambiguous, and indecipherable things from different histories and classes. Rossetti's paintings revive 18th century cabinets of curiosity, whose objects were united by the collector's taste for strange, rare, beautiful things full of variety and plenitude. Cabinets performed the magical, exotic, and theatrical. But by 1850, as anthropologists argue, the cabinet was considered too passionate, too subject to the article collected, too feminine to measure up to the discipline and rigor of the museum with its classification systems. Victorian classification systems fixed objects' meanings, subordinating objects to classification in museums, and making them rational commodities in shops and ads. But Rossetti empties things of spectators' associated meanings, and thus his paintings permit virtual objects to escape Victorian propriety and commodification to become fetishes. The unclassifiable fetish exists in a border zone without routine stability of meaning in everyday life. It is animated, able to dominate people, tied to global trade, yet outside everyday use or market exchange, and outside fashion or the social order. As wonder became subordinate to Enlightenment taxonomy, rarity, and fetish, such objects became bric-a-brac, the word Rossetti used to describe his objects. Rossetti's Victorian biographer, Meyer, claimed that, quote, bric-a-brac was a purely original idea in those days. Those who follow the fashion today do it vulgarly and unintelligently, turning their houses into museums of costly and incongruous objects. But Rossetti knew to a hairbreadth what would harmonize and what would not. His judgment was a touchstone. But Rossetti's modernist biographer, Evelyn Waugh, described Rossetti as, quote, errant and erring, guided entirely by his momentary preferences for extraneous objects without reference to their relevance, end quote. Joining these views, Jessica Feldman argues that Rossetti combined bric-a-brac and modernism. I would suggest that bric-a-brac became a strategic tool with which to criticize Victorian taste through an elevation of secondhand things. Major H. Bing Hall, in his 1868 book on bric-a-brac, explains the term's wide range of things that turned both aristocrats with taste and the tasteless lower orders equally into mere resellers of things, from antiquities to trivia, all, he said, that is precious and beautiful as well as mediocre in art, and thus linking aesthetics and commerce. Recent anthropologists studying bric-a-brac seem to agree with Hall, and they describe such things as indecipherable, failing to either reveal their owner's social status or to suggest the meaning in these typically narrativeless objects in Victorian parlors. Rossetti himself never restored or revived these objects' histories, but he left them as fetishes, isolated, distinct, and unconnected to other things. His melanged objects, his rage for strangeness, as Ford Madox Brown called it, created what F.G. Stevens termed barbaric jewelry in Stevens' 1896 description of what he called the modern Venetian and sumptuous painting, The Bride, whose special systems of symbols and a unique vocabulary for artistic expressions, in Waugh's words, befit what Graham Robertson called Rossetti's sweeping away preconceived ideas. Rossetti thus purposely staged aestheticism as a response to burgeoning cultural artifacts, apart from religion, morality, history, fashion, or iconography. He contributed to art's autonomy by decontextualizing objects to negotiate new relations between art and spectators through these uncanny objects that were both like and unlike goods that were disseminated, displayed, and consumed in Victorian England. Display is a language producing meanings through juxtaposed objects' similarities and differences. Objects accrue value by passing through Liberty's window or museums or Rossetti's paintings. Rossetti's virtual strange and estranged things performed an imaginary aesthetic revisionism of cultural meanings, like Dorian Gray or Descent's fictional collections that were counter-canons of unorganic, hybrid, unhomogenized, transhistorical objects of unknown origins. As Jonathan Friedman argues, aestheticism's gospel of art's autonomy meant to liberate art from commerce, instead assimilated art to consumerism. He says the experience of art as an end in itself made art a consumable to satisfy spectators' desires and appropriations. Rossetti's things exist between aestheticism and commerciality and generate meanings by drawing on and critiquing both, using the power of the virtual image to suggest new values by inducing disorientation, strangeness, fantasy, and fetishism in an aesthetic of singularity. In conclusion, Rossetti's paintings displayed objects that were outside status, fashion, or wealth. This fetishism, in which objects dominate people, is the opposite of the ensembles, whose homogenizing social forces, including homogenizing women and domestic interiors. Rossetti's defiance of ensembles had consequences, I think, for his representation of women. Kristen Lysak suggests that middle-class women's consumption made visible the porous boundary between high and low culture and trafficked freely between them, giving women some agency. Rossetti's virtual women are not simply ornamental females in feminized spaces, but artists who produce these objects' meanings as well as consume them. Rossetti certainly depicted objects he and Whistler collected, but he kept his things strategically distant from high-end goods. He combined aestheticism's astringent taste with kitsch to assert his aesthetic authority in a world in which artist authority perhaps no longer guided public taste. Nevertheless, he anticipated Mary Elizabeth Howis's advice in 1878 not to follow, she says, the mistaken craze for parure, but to rely on change and variety in dress, a view anticipated by Rossetti, in whose house she moved in 1883. In his Disensembles of Strange Things, Rossetti suggested new aesthetic relations across commercial and cultural venues. His virtual things were equally discursive with, yet critical of, shops, ads, and aestheticism. Thank you.